How would you feel if no one remembered your birthday? Mrs. Grace, a mother neglected by her children for years, celebrated her birthday alone. No one remembered it was her special day. But this year would be different. That morning, Mrs. Grace woke up with a familiar ache in her chest. It was her birthday, but the day no longer felt special. She lived alone in a quiet little house filled with memories of laughter and love, memories that seemed a lifetime ago. Her children had grown up, moved far away, and while they occasionally sent cards, she rarely saw them. Most of her time was spent by the window, watching the world pass by. Occasionally, she would see families walking by, children skipping ahead while their parents followed behind, or elderly couples strolling arm in arm. Each sight brought bittersweet memories. Today, she felt especially lonely. The silence of her house reminded her another year had passed without anyone by her side. The night before, Mrs. Grace had baked herself a small cake, a simple recipe she remembered from years ago. Carefully, she placed the cake on the table, set 2 candles beside it, and poured herself a cup of tea. She sat in silence, her heart heavy, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. By late afternoon, a knock at the door broke the silence. Startled, her first thought was that her children had come to surprise her for her birthday. Her face lit up, and she felt a pang of guilt for doubting them. How could they forget the mother who had given them life and raised them with so much love and care? She quickly wiped away her tears and hurried to the door. But standing there wasn't her children. It was a young man with a gentle smile and a small bouquet of wild flowers. He must be a delivery boy, she thought. His clothes were neat but simple, and there was a warmth in his face she couldn't quite place. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Grace," the young man said softly. "My name is Jack. I pass by your house every day on my way to work. Today you looked a little sad, so I thought I'd stop by. I brought these for you." Mrs. Grace felt her heart tighten at his thoughtful gesture. "Oh, thank you, Jack. That's so kind of you," she said, her voice trembling. She invited him in, not wanting him to leave so soon. She couldn't even remember the last time she had a visitor. They sat at her small kitchen table with a cake between them. Jack noticed the 2 candles and, embarrassed, Mrs. Grace explained, "It's my birthday today. I baked this for myself, but I didn't expect anyone to share it with." "Happy birthday, Mrs. Grace," Jack said warmly. "Why don't we light those candles and celebrate?" Her hands shook as she lit the 2 small candles. Together they sang, "Happy birthday." Mrs. Grace's voice was soft, choked with emotion, while Jack's voice rang out brightly, filling the room with a new, vibrant warmth. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. As they ate the small cake, Mrs. Grace shared stories from her past, memories of her children when they were young, tales of her late husband, and how they had built a life together in this very home. Jack listened intently, his eyes filled with kindness and respect. He asked questions and laughed along with her stories. As the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the room, Jack finally rose to leave. But before stepping out the door, he turned back. I'll come back soon, Mrs. Grace. I'd love to hear more of your stories." Overcome with emotion, Mrs. Grace hugged him, her hands trembling as she held onto the stranger who had shown her more kindness than anyone had in years. She watched him walk down the street, feeling a lightness in her chest she hadn't known in a long time. From that day on, Jack visited Mrs. Grace every week. He brought small gifts, a plate of apple pie his mother had baked, a basket of fresh fruit from his family's garden, and sometimes just himself, ready to listen and chat. Jack became the family Mrs. Grace had missed, filling her days with laughter and companionship. The house, once quiet and empty, now brimmed with life and joy. One evening, as they sat together, Mrs. Grace spoke softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "Jack, I've been thinking. I never had grandchildren, and my own children, well, they have their own lives. I've been alone for so long, but you've changed that. You've given me a reason to smile again." Jack smiled warmly, his eyes full of affection. "Mrs. Grace, you feel like family to me too. I lost my grandmother years ago, and meeting you has felt like finding her again." That very evening they decided Mrs. Grace would legally adopt Jack as her grandson. The decision brought immense joy to both of them. Jack visited more often, helped with household chores, and even brought friends over on occasion, filling the house with laughter and warmth. Mrs. Grace felt younger, happier, and her heart overflowed with gratitude. But as time passed, Mrs. Grace's health began to decline. The once lively house grew quiet again as she became bedridden. Jack remained by her side, loyal as ever. He held her hand, read to her, and comforted her as her strength faded. She would smile at him and say, "I'm so lucky you knocked on my door that day, Jack. You made my final years the happiest of my life." One peaceful morning, Mrs. Grace passed away. Jack stayed by her side until the very end, his heart breaking as he lost a woman who had become family to him. After her passing, her children were notified. However, they seemed only faintly interested. A few days later, the family gathered to hear her will. Expecting to inherit something valuable, her children were stunned when the lawyer read Mrs. Grace's shaky handwriting. "To my children, I wish you happiness, even though our paths have drifted apart. I hope you find joy in your lives. But to Jack, who gave me love and joy when I had nothing left, I leave this house. It has been filled with memories of kindness and laughter because of you, and I hope you fill it with your own happiness." Jack's eyes filled with tears as he realized the depth of Mrs. Grace's love for him. Her children, shocked, exclaimed, "She left everything to a stranger." But Jack knew he was no stranger. He was her family, the one who had been there when she needed someone the most. The house, filled with cherished memories, now belonged to him. She hadn't left behind money or jewels, but something far more precious, a home filled with warmth and love. A few weeks later, Jack received a letter from the family's lawyer. Her children had filed a lawsuit demanding the will be overturned and the house returned to them. Jack sighed, not with anger, but with sadness. It only confirmed what Mrs. Grace had endured, loneliness and neglect from those who should have loved her most. The day of the trial finally arrived. The courtroom was packed, filled with curious onlookers and eager reporters. Mrs. Grace's children, David, Laura, and Emily, sat confidently at the plaintiff's table, their expressions filled with arrogance. They argued that Jack was nothing more than a stranger, that their mother might have been mentally influenced when drafting her will, and that the house rightfully belonged to their family. Their lawyer began, "Your Honor, my clients are the sole rightful heirs of Mrs. Grace's estate. For a complete stranger like Jack to inherit the entire property is both unreasonable and ethically questionable. We respectfully request the court to award this house back to Mrs. Grace's family." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Jack sat quietly at the defendant's table, his face calm as always. When called to testify, he rose, walking deliberately to the stand. Jack began speaking, his voice deep and steady, yet brimming with emotion. "Your Honor, I have no intention of disputing with Mrs. Grace's children. I don't need this house for its monetary value. In truth, I don't even seek gratitude or recognition. The only thing I desire is to preserve this house, not because it is a piece of property, but because it holds the cherished memories of Mrs. Grace, the woman who treated me like family." Jack turned to face Mrs. Grace's children directly, his gaze devoid of anger, filled instead with a profound sadness. "David, Laura, Emily," he continued, his tone steady but piercing, "if you want this house, take it. But I plead with you, treat it as a child should treat their mother's legacy. Care for it as a way to atone for having left her alone in the loneliest years of her life." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Jack's words seemed to pierce through everyone present. Turning back to the judge, Jack added, "This house, to me, is more than four walls. It is the place where Mrs. Grace and I created her final memories. It is where I saw her smile, where I listened to her life stories. If the court decides to award the house to her children, I will not contest it. But if allowed, I would like to remain in this house to care for it and preserve what remains of her legacy." When Jack finished, an unusual stillness filled the courtroom. Even Mrs. Grace's children couldn't hide the unease on their faces. Their lawyer fumbled, struggling to find a rebuttal. The judge announced a recess to deliberate further. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. Laura, Mrs. Grace's second daughter, suddenly stood, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say, but I think my mother was right to leave the house to you. We were wrong. For all these years, we never fulfilled our duty to her." David and Emily lowered their heads, unable to find words. They realized that compared to Jack, who had cared for their mother in her final days, they had no rightful claim to the house. After the trial, Mrs. Grace's children officially withdrew their lawsuit. Jack said nothing more, simply shaking their hands gently before returning to the little house. He continued to care for it as a way to honor the woman who had changed his life. David, Laura, and Emily began visiting the house more often. They brought flowers, repaired small corners of the home, and shared stories about Mrs. Grace they had long neglected. All of this was thanks to Jack, who helped them see the true meaning of family and redemption. The house, once a symbol of loneliness, was now filled with laughter, tears, and love. Just like in the best days, when Mrs. Grace was still alive.